Coming to you from the North Devon coast, this is Coaching Radio, the sound of success. Welcome. You are listening to me, Dave Baxter, with my very special guest, Bill Murtha. Bill is a self-confessed writer, activist, philanthropist and tattooed man. But we won't delve into that one this evening. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave.
It seems that you have taken a very unorthodox path to becoming a published author, one that was clearly inspired by a near-death experience back in 1999. In your book, Dying for a Change, you talk a lot about how that one experience totally launched you off in an altogether different life direction. Can you give me a brief overview, me and the listeners of course, of your manic, hectic life at that time?
Well, it seems a long time ago now, Dave. I'm going to take you back to 1999, in a time when I was travelling across Europe, and I had a job with a high pressure job with a big corporation. And like a lot of people today, you know, with all the worries and stresses, I had quite a manic, hectic, stressful lifestyle. I was away a lot, you know, working 80-hour weeks. And, you know, I was sort of losing my sense of meaning. And it was at that point that I had this accident that, you know, that went on to sort of change my way of thinking and how I perceive what was important and, you know, the true meaning of my life, really.
So in other words, similar to what we're all in some way going through today.
Yeah, I think many of us are sort of at a point of change at the moment. We don't really know. You know, we're questioning where we are, who we are, and I think there's this massive fundamental shift going on, you know, this upheaval with, you know, our jobs and our, you know, the taxes and just the way we're being asked to change in many different ways. And I think this is sort of bringing a change in our relationships, in you know, in our jobs, and I think we're all at that point now where we're sort of looking at new ways of living and new ways of sort of trying to understand what our lives mean to us. And I think many of us in different ways are coming to that point.
You're listening to Dave Baxter on Coaching Radio. Yeah, so do you think you could explain a little bit about the accident, Bill? Because it certainly altered your view of the whole meaning of death, didn't it? I understand that some very peculiar events happened to you on that one evening. Tell us about it and why it was so different.
Yeah, I mean, that's an understatement, peculiar. I mean, I can remember this one particular day in April 1999, and, you know, I'm going back there, and you know, it was one of them days where you just sort of think is a normal day, and it was very stressful. And, you know, I'd been out in the car, and, you know, I'd listened to a few poignant things in the radio, which looking back now were just so synchronistic, it was unbelievable. But I wasn't home that often in the evenings, but when I was, I used to, where I live in Dawlish on the South Devon coast, to de-stress, I used to go out on my bike in an evening. And on this one particular day, late April 1999, there I was pedalling on my push bike along the seawall, which is a big 5-mile long stretch for anyone that's been along the Dawlish Warren coastal path, right next to the railway line. You know, the sun was going down and I'm pedalling along mad, and I used to have this sort of feeling that I wanted to almost hurt myself, because it's almost like the pain was sort of a way of taking away the stresses of the day. So, you know, I'd be pushing hard and sort of pushing down on the pedals and really sort of trying to work myself up into a sweat and really feel that pain on my legs and my stomach. On this one particular night, you know, it started off very still, and I left home, and, you know, half an hour into the journey, which is about halfway through the duration of the hour which I usually went out for, I was pedalling along, and suddenly from nowhere this freak wave came up, crashing up through the wall, and about 20 foot up, and it hit me and soaked me, and it took me off my bike, and I hit my head on against the back wall that joined the railway line and the pathway. I suddenly sort of tipped over and I was soaking, and I remember laughing. You know, I laughed at the sheer thought of having to tell my wife that I was soaking wet. It was freezing cold. I barely had time to get up onto one knee, and a second wave came crashing over, only this time it caught me unaware. It almost knocked me out. Next thing I realise, I'm spinning around and there's water gushing down, and before I knew it, I'm clawing onto the pathway trying to stop myself from falling, but it was too late. And I first of all saw the bike go over, then I went over, and I'm crashing. The next thing I realise, I'm crashing down onto some rocks, or towards some rocks sort of 20 foot below. And it's at that point, it goes through your mind, I'm going to crash and smash my head on the rocks. And luckily, I just got to the point where I'd landed right between these two rocks, hit the crashing sort of sea, and it was freezing cold. And I remember I sort of popped back up again, and I just sort of launched into this sort of celebration because I punched the air, and I was so sort of happy and elated that I'd sort of missed the rocks. And then it suddenly dawned on me, the waves started pummeling me against the sea wall. And I looked up, and it was a 20-foot high, algae-covered wall. It's getting dark, and it's suddenly, the waves are sort of hitting me into the wall. And I just suddenly realised, it just suddenly dawned on me that, I've got probably a couple of seconds to really start sorting myself out. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. And it's amazing that even at these stages of your life, when I had this sort of epiphany come through, this amazing sort of thought. For anyone that remembers the BBC 999 programme that used to feature near deaths, I just had this sort of message that came through loud and clear, and it basically said, take the next sort of 60 seconds to really sort of not panic, because it's panic that often kills you, and not the fact that you can't swim. So I just managed to sort of gradually centre myself, and I started to get my act together, and I just suddenly realised that I wanted to keep close to the wall, but the tide was on the way out, and the waves are bashing me. I realised the tide is starting to pull me out, and within a couple of minutes, I'm already 10, 20, 30 yards outside, away from the wall, and I'm frantically trying to sort of stay close to the wall, but I couldn't. The water's freezing cold, I'm panicking, all sorts of things are going through my head, and by then, sort of 10 minutes in, I'm sort of the hypothermia starting to kick in. It's at that point that, I'm starting to surrender and let go, and realise that I've just got to conserve as much energy as I can. I've got to really start to get my stuff together. And then this is when, this most bizarre thing starts to sort of happen, because I started to let go, and I knew I was in trouble, because the hypothermia at its worst, when it was giving me pain and suffering, at the worst time, it's like somebody drilling. For anyone that's had hypothermia, before, they realise that it's like somebody drilling into your bones. The pain is sort of unbelievable. But I knew that something was shifting in me, because the pain started to subside, and I started to feel really good, and I started to feel warm. And this is when I realised that I was starting to knock on the door, and I was getting worried that, I'm starting to lose my senses, or I was worried that I was starting to lose, consciousness. And it's at that point that I started to accept, and this overriding peace started coming in, to my presence. At that point, I can remember the first thing, I looked at the sea wall, and then I looked over towards the red cliffs that were, the sun was dying, and the red cliffs were bright, so I remember a bright colour. And it's at that point that I started to almost lose a sense of who I was as an individual. And it's almost like my consciousness was starting to mould into something else. So I started to become that cliff. And the most bizarre thing happened. I looked up at a seagull. It just looked so majestic in the dying sun. And I remember looking up at this seagull, and I almost become that seagull. And the next thing, I'm sort of looking down at the water as if I'm gliding on the thermals, and I am that seagull. And then I look towards the sun, and then for a minute I am that sun. And these unbelievable sort of sensations started to come into me. And I didn't realise if I was starting to dream, if I was starting to lose my own consciousness. But whatever was happening, my identity was starting to fuse. And this was hard for me. This isn't someone who had, was a right brain sort of, new ager, or this is someone who was the most pragmatic person you could ever meet. These sort of things didn't happen to me, and when they did, it started to freak me out, because I didn't like the uncontrol of it all.
What did you do then to survive?
I mean, it got I've obviously lose sense of time, and I remember my watch. I had my granddad's watch on at the time, and that had stopped, and all I knew, it was getting dark, and there was no one about, and I thought, this is it. There's no one going to be about. At that point, I just started to. First of all, I started to get these reruns. I wouldn't say a life review, because a life review that we all hear about, so-called life review at the point of death, we hear from start to finish. And what I had was this unbelievably set of different images and playbacks, as if what I now know in retrospect is that I had these reruns of different poignant parts of my life that were probably some of the most emotional times of my life, and all of those were played out, and they were played out as if I was actually there in the moment. And I'll give you one example. I got knocked over as an 11-year-old, and I remember the experience of being knocked out and thinking I died. Anyway, in the water, I've actually relived that whole experience. Not only am I the 11-year-old boy, I felt as if I was in that body running across the road. I can remember the car hitting me, and then everything went black. But what the strange thing was, the next image that came to me in the water wasn't another rerun of another past experience from my childhood. It was, I'm looking up and I realise I'm driving a car. And the car, I'm looking at the nails and my fingernails, and they're painted. And I realise I'm a woman, and I'm driving along in this car, and suddenly I see myself as the 11-year-old boy. And I hit myself, so I drive into the 11-year-old boy, which is me. I crash the car. I'm shaking sort of furiously. I get out of the car. All my tights are ripped. I collapse on the floor. I'm shaking. I'm screaming that I've killed a boy. And it suddenly dawned on me that I was actually seeing the whole situation from another perspective, but I was reliving it from the woman that actually knocked me down, all those years ago, and it was just incredible. But I won't go too much into detail, but there are several other things that I relived. Anyway, after all these reruns had played out, I'm just about to start letting go, thinking this is it, what happens next? Does a dead relative come? I really felt that my body was starting to pack up. I was getting pains in all of my organs, and, I knew that was a bad sign, and I started to let go. I'd almost put all my demons to bed. I'd said goodbye in my mind to my kids and my wife, thinking, I was very upset. I wasn't going to see my children get married, give them away. I thought of my wife sort of spending all the insurance money, and like we do, because I was insured for a lot of money then, and you're thinking, yeah, and she's going to be all right for her. She's going to be able to get married again with someone else that can have a part-time job and spend all my, insurance money. I just remember, accepting basically that everything is, my life is ended.